This is my chance. As they gather, I discreetly slip away into a side alcove of the great chamber, a small recess in the rock they hadn't explored. My historian's curiosity compels me. Perhaps the artist's studio? The torchlight from a passing group member briefly illuminates the inside of the alcove. I see what look like tools. Seashells, used as containers for mixing red and yellow ochre pigments. Pieces of pine charcoal, of different thicknesses. Stone lamps, small bowls with a hole for a moss wick, which would have been filled with animal fat to provide light. It's an intimate glimpse into the creative process. And then, I see it. On a small stone ledge, next to a shelf full of red ochre powder, rests an object that does not belong in this place. An object that does not belong to this era. It is rectangular, dark, covered in worn leather. Its straight lines and perfect angles are an affront to the organic nature of everything around me. It's my book. Temps Deviationum. My heart leaps, this time from pure relief. It's there, waiting for me, as if I had just left it to get a coffee. How did it get here? The book has its own rules, its own consciousness, perhaps. It takes me where I need to go, and when the lesson is over, when the experience is complete, it shows up to get me. There is no other explanation. With my hands still shaking, but now with excitement, I lunge forward and grab it. The familiar leather under my fingers is the most real thing I've felt in hours. Its weight in my hand is comforting. It's time to go home. I clutch the book to my chest and turn back to the main chamber. The group has already started moving towards the exit, their silhouettes retreating into the darkness. Thanks for the show, guys, I whisper to their backs. It was educational. I give it 5 stars on Time Yelp, but the room service is terrible. I open the book. The pages seem to glow with their own light in the darkness. I find the return inscription, the Latin words that are now as dear to me as my Wi-Fi password. I read in a low, hoarse, trembling voice. Ad mea, tempora, redditus, nunc. The instant the last syllable leaves my lips, the cave walls begin to dissolve. The majestic paintings of lions and rhinos become blurs, streaks of light that writhe. The distant chant of the shaman distorts into an electronic hum. The feeling of being pulled down the drain of the universe returns, the familiar temporal vortex, the smell of ozone and, yes, there it is, the unmistakable sound of a laughing goat. Bam! Silence. A noisy silence, full of the hum of the fluorescent light and the smell of mold and mothballs. I am on the floor of my grandmother's basement. Face down. My face is pressed against the cold, dusty cement. I am completely soaked, covered in a prehistoric mud that is starting to stink in the 113-degree heat of the room. I am shaking violently, not from cold, but from the shock of the transition. The heat of the basement, which I hated so much, now feels like the most luxurious embrace in the world. The smell of old age is the perfume of safety. I get up, my knees cracking in protest. The book is on the floor beside me. I pick it up, close it with a definitive snap, and place it back on the pile of crossword puzzle magazines. Never again, I swear to the leather cover, a promise we both know is a lie. I climb the stairs, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the way. Each step up is a step away from the darkness, the cold, the overwhelming beauty, and the terror of the origin of time. I open the door and am greeted by the yellow light of my grandmother's kitchen. I'm home. I'm exhausted. And I desperately need a hot bath that lasts, at a minimum, about 30,000 years. And while I go and try to wash the Pleistocene mud off my sweatshirt and convince my body not to go into hypothermia, I wish you all a great night's sleep. Enjoy your warm beds, your blankets, and the complete absence of saber-toothed tigers in the hallway. And since you clearly have fun at my expense, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. It's the least you can do in return for watching a historian almost become a fossil. Click it. Now, if you'll excuse me, this hot water isn't going to waste itself. And that's when I saw them. They were giants. No, seriously. The average height in my time is already greater than in most of history, but these guys made basketball players look like children. Huge men, most with blonde or red hair, braided into long, complex beards and hairstyles. But it wasn't the braids or the height that caught the eye. It was what they wore and what they carried. They wore silk tunics dyed a deep crimson, a color reserved for royalty, with gold details. Over them, chainmail that shone under the Mediterranean sun. And the weapons. Oh, the weapons. Most carried an axe. Not a little lumberjack hatchet. A Dane axe, with a long wooden handle, almost the height of a man, and a curved blade, brutal and terrifyingly sharp. They looked like a walking contradiction, the opulence of the Eastern Roman Empire mixed with the barbaric ferocity of the frozen North. My brain, that traitorous nerd, connected the dots before the panic could fully set in. Blonde and red hair. Dane axes. Imperial silk tunics. The setting of a city that could only be that city. Miklagard, the great city, as the Norse called it. Constantinople. And these men, these were the Varangian Guard. The most famous elite corps of the medieval world. Mercenaries. The personal guard of the Byzantine Emperor. Vikings, Swedes, Norwegians, even some exiled Anglo-Saxons, all drawn by the promise of one single thing that transcended kingdoms and cultures: gold. An obscene amount of gold. They were famous for two things: their unwavering loyalty to the throne, a loyalty bought, paid for, and maintained with pounds of gold coins, and their terrifying skill in combat. They were the bodyguards of the most powerful man in the world. Basically, the Secret Service of the 11th century, but with much more facial hair and a tendency to solve diplomatic problems with an axe. And I, Ned, with my mustard-stained sweatshirt from last week and my metal braces, was standing in the middle of the street, staring at them with my mouth open. One of them, a true oak cabinet of a man with a red beard so magnificent it would make a Tolkien dwarf weep with envy, slowly turned his head in my direction. His blue eyes, as cold as the ice of a fjord, sized me up. He nudged his companion, a blonde with a scar that split his eyebrow in two, and pointed in my direction with his chin. Great. I've been noticed. My plan to be a discreet observer lasted exactly 14 seconds. A new personal record for failure. The giant redhead approached. Each of his steps seemed to make the stone ground tremble. I wanted to run, but my feet decided it was a great time to merge with the pavement. "NYR," he growled. The word was Old Norse. It meant new one? I just blinked. My mind was a blank slate. I could have answered in Latin, English, or maybe just let out a high-pitched sound of panic. Instead, my brain decided on the stupidest possible option. Hi," I said, in Portuguese. A language that wouldn't exist in a recognizable form for several more hundred years. The giant frowned. He looked at my red hair, then at my pale, freckled face. Then he looked at my strange clothes. For a moment, I thought he was going to cut me in half just for offending his aesthetic sense. He then let out a laugh, a low, guttural sound, like Rolling Stones. He turned to his friend. "Shueta. Essi litter ut fire a hafa vilst uarva gunny. Ea kanski er etan jasta tiskafra." He paused and looked at me again. "Vanyaskapunam ert?" He was asking where the hell I was from. He thought I was a new recruit. A boy who had gotten lost from his cradle. My red hair, a common feature in Northern Europe, was my passport to hell. They didn't see me as a complete stranger, but as one of their own, just weird. Very weird. Before I could try some charades or just faint, which was looking like an increasingly attractive option, he placed a hand on my shoulder. His hand was the size of a dinner plate and weighed a ton. He turned me around and gently pushed me in the direction they were going. Gently for him meant I nearly fell flat on my face. "Kom du. Draken heifer ekki allen dagen. Come on. The Draken doesn't have all day. Draken. The Dragon." One of the titles for the guard's commander. And that's how I, Ned, the lazy, the complainer, was recruited into the Varangian Guard. No forms, no medical exam, no asking if I had any experience with weapons beyond a video game controller. Apparently, being a redhead and looking lost was qualification enough. They led me through wide streets, paved with marble, lined with statues of dead emperors and elaborate fountains. The common people, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, merchants from every corner of the known world, made way for us. No one looked a Varangian in the eye. The fear and respect were palpable. And I was in the middle of them, a trembling imposter in his worn-out sneakers. We arrived at a complex of buildings near the Great Palace. The barracks. On the outside, classic Byzantine architecture, with arches and bricks. On the inside, it was a fascinating cultural mess. There were Christian mosaics on the walls, depicting saints with large, sad eyes, but on a solid wooden table, someone had carved Norse runes and the image of a wolf devouring the moon. The smell was of leather, weapon polishing oil, sweat, and ale. It was a frat house dorm room, if the students were all 7-foot-tall homicidal weightlifters. I was pushed into a corner. The red-headed giant, whose name I found out was Bjorn, pointed to a wooden bench. "Sit, Ja. Sit." I sat. And then I observed. And my nerd brain began to catalog everything. trying to find some comfort in academic analysis while my life was at risk. The first thing that shattered one of the greatest myths of history was hygiene. The stereotype of the Viking is that of a dirty, stinking barbarian with food stuck in his beard. A complete lie. And I had the proof right in front of me. In one corner, a Varangian who couldn't have been more than 20 years old was meticulously grooming himself. He had a small set of polished bronze tools. With tweezers, he was plucking his eyebrows. With a small razor, he was cleaning up the lines of his beard on his neck. And with a masterfully decorated bone comb, he was detangling and styling his long blonde hair. He did this with a concentration and care that I rarely dedicated to anything in my life. At another table, two men were talking in Old Norse, and one of them was using a small metal tool to clean the wax from his ears. They were ear spoons, artifacts that archaeologists find in droves in Viking graves, along with combs, tweezers, and razors. Historical accounts, like those of the English cleric John of Wallingford, suddenly made sense. He complained that the Vikings were excessively popular with Anglo-Saxon women because they bathed every Saturday, combed their hair, and wore clean clothes. For the English of the time, who might have considered one bath a year a social event, this was practically witchcraft. And here, in Constantinople, with access to Roman public baths, a legacy of luxury and cleanliness, the Varangians were probably the cleanest and best-smelling soldiers in the Byzantine army. Well, best-smelling within a certain context, of course. Deodorant was still about 1,000 years away. But the image of the filthy barbarian crumbled before my eyes. They were vain and meticulous warriors, which, in a way, made them even more terrifying. No one that dedicated to trimming his beard would be careless when swinging an axe in your direction. While I was pondering this surprising Viking skincare routine, an argument began to heat up between two older Varangians near me. It wasn't a fight, but a heated verbal dispute. From what I could understand with my fragmented knowledge of the language, it wasn't about gold, women, or honor in battle. It was about a fence. A property line back in their homeland, probably in Sweden or Norway. One of them, a man with a weather-beaten face and hands like tree roots, slammed his fist on the table. EFV Veramheima, Mindum Viakulja Etta Ingenu. Milogam OG Vietnam, Eins OG Verjalsermen. My brain slowly translated. If we were home, we would settle this at the thing. With laws and witnesses, like free men. The thing. The assembly. Another concept that movies and TV conveniently forget. We think of Vikings as violent anarchists, but they had one of the most sophisticated legal and political systems of their time. The Thing, or Althing in Iceland, was an open-air parliament. Free men, and the definition of free was very specific, of course, gathered to create laws, judge disputes, and make political decisions that affected the entire community. It wasn't a king or a lord who decided everything from the top down. It was an assembly. The Icelandic Althing, founded in 930 AD, is considered one of the oldest parliaments in the world, still functioning today. It was there that everything was decided, from land disputes, like the one between my Barak mates, to the conversion of the entire nation to Christianity. They debated. They voted. They had law speakers, the Lgskumor, who had to memorize all the laws of the nation. A human external hard drive. And there was a delicious and bitter irony there. Those two men, serving as mercenaries to the most autocratic monarch in the world, the Byzantine emperor, a man whose word was absolute law, missed their primitive democratic system to resolve a dispute over a fence. They had traded their rights as free men in an assembly for a pile of gold in the richest city in the world. A choice many would make today, I imagine. Trading freedom for financial security. Maybe times haven't changed that much. My socio-political meditation was interrupted by a leather boot that stopped right in front of my face. Slowly, I looked up. It was Bjorn, the red-headed giant, again. He had a look that mixed amusement and contempt. Behind him stood an older, severe-looking man with graying hair and an even more ornate cloak. The so-called Draken, the commander. The commander looked at me as if I were an interesting insect he had found in his salad. He said something in Greek to Bjorn. Bjorn replied in broken Greek with a heavy Norse accent. There was a brief exchange of words. The commander looked at my teeth. Yes, at my braces. He pulled back my lip with his finger, without the slightest ceremony. Argentum indentibus? Silver in his teeth? He asked, with genuine curiosity. Bjorn shrugged. Kanski or Henriker? Maybe he's rich. That seemed to satisfy the commander. Wealth was something they understood. He said a few more quick words to Bjorn and walked away, clearly uninterested in me. Bjorn turned back to me. He threw a wooden bucket on the floor in front of me. The noise echoed in the barracks. Ert Heppen, Valper. You're lucky, pup. He pointed to the bucket, then to the latrines at the back of the courtyard. I vermoren Sajure er sem tener nar you are malmi, a with the cute urdu of Dermeter till a dage chilfun. Anga till vi finum almanaliga brunhosu og jam firerig, a with the cute eta vopniet. My brain struggled. The commander says that since your teeth are made of metal, you're too valuable to die in training. Until we find a chainmail and helmet that fit you, this is your weapon. He pointed to the bucket and the filth. My job. To clean the latrines of the most dangerous elite troop on the planet. I looked at the bucket. I looked at Bjorn. I looked at my life. I traded a moldy basement for this. Definitely an upgrade. I sighed. A long, tired sigh that came from the depths of my lazy, battered soul. I picked up the bucket. It was heavy. Of course it was. My great Viking Age adventure had begun. Not with a sword in hand, but with a bucket. And a stinky destiny. Wonderful. Simply wonderful. There is a certain philosophical clarity you only achieve when you're on your knees, with a dubious wooden bucket, about to confront the bodily waste of a platoon of medieval supermen. It's a moment of profound introspection. You think about your life choices, the paths not taken, the time your mother suggested you take a programming course instead of majoring in ancient history. I should have listened to my mother. The latrines of the Varangian barracks were not, to my surprise, just a hole in the ground. The Byzantines, heirs to the Romans, knew a thing or two about plumbing. It was a system of stone seats over a channel with a constant flow of water underneath. A marvel of 11th century sanitary engineering. The problem wasn't the design. The problem was the contents. And my job, apparently, was to ensure that the user experience for these Norse giants was impeccable. Scrubbing the stone seats, throwing buckets of water to make sure nothing got stuck in the system. As I worked, immersed in a miasma of despair and odors that would make a skunk apologize, I had a privileged view of the training yard. And what I saw was a live history lesson, more brutal and effective than any documentary. The men who hours before had been polishing their nails and braiding their beards now moved with a hypnotic ferocity. They didn't train like Roman or Greek armies, with rigid formations and marching discipline. They trained as individuals, as predators. I saw two of them sparring with round shields and swords. It wasn't elegant fencing. It was a violent dance of parrying, pushing with the shield, trying to break the opponent's line for a fatal blow. Every move was economical and deadly. But the real star of the show was the Dane axe. Bjorn, my red-headed recruiter, was there, teaching a younger recruit. He wielded the long-handled axe with a terrifying fluidity. He didn't handle it with brute force, but with his entire body, using the weight of the blade and momentum to create arcs of destruction. He showed the kid how to hook a shield with the lower tip of the blade to pull it down, exposing the torso. He showed how to use the long handle to trip an opponent. He showed how a downward blow could, according to his graphic demonstration on a wooden post, split a helmet and the skull inside like a melon. They were the personification of bought loyalty. The Byzantine emperor, sitting on his golden throne in the great palace, did not trust his own people. Byzantine politics was a nest of vipers, full of intrigue, coups, and poisonings. So, what did he do? He imported his bodyguards. He paid warriors from a distant land, who had no ties to local noble families, no political ambitions in Constantinople, and whose only interest was their salary. And what a salary! A common Varangian earned a salary that was a fortune by Scandinavian standards. But the real prize came in other forms. They had the right to pillage the palace after an emperor's death, a succession bonus that could make them rich overnight. They received gifts, lands, and, above all, status. Serving in the Varangian Guard was the pinnacle of a Norse mercenary's career. It was like getting hired by Apple and Google at the same time. They returned home, to their farms in Norway or villages in Sweden, as absurdly wealthy men, building churches and halls to display their fortune. They were living proof that the dream of getting rich in a foreign land was possible. As I scrubbed a particularly stubborn stain on the stone, I overheard a conversation between two guards who were on sentry duty near me. They spoke quietly, but the boredom in their voices was evident. Sastu Anlit Grikjan Zigar Kizarin Gaf Bjorn and Gullring, one said. Did you see the Greek's face when the emperor gave Bjorn that gold ring? The other snorted. Errol eins. Juker. Fiender VBL. Skilja eins Gull. They're all the same. Soft. Afraid of blood. They only understand gold. There was a clear contempt in their voices. To the Varangians, the Byzantines, whom they generically called Greeks, were decadent, effeminate, unworthy of the wealth and power they possessed. It was a bizarre symbiotic relationship. The most sophisticated empire in the world depended on barbarians to protect its leader, and the barbarians despised the civilization that paid them, even as they enjoyed its luxuries. They were the watchdogs, and they knew it. Well-paid and dangerous watchdogs, but watchdogs nonetheless. I finished the first latrine. A small personal triumph. I looked at the other 9. My spirit withered. I picked up my bucket and moved on to the next one, a Sisyphus with a makeshift mop. It was then that a new character entered the scene. A Byzantine man, small and slender, dressed in a simple but clean tunic. He carried a wooden tray with bread, olives, and a small jug of wine. He approached the 2 guards and offered the tray with a nervous bow. One of the guards took a piece of bread without a word. The other ignored him completely, continuing to stare at the courtyard. The Byzantine man stood there for a moment in an awkward silence before turning to leave. As he passed me, he looked at me. His dark eyes scanned my strange clothes, my red hair, and my soot-stained face. He saw the bucket in my hand. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in the eyes of the Varangians: pity. He hesitated, looked at the guards, who weren't paying attention, and discreetly placed a small flatbread on the edge of the stone structure near me. He gave an almost imperceptible nod and hurried away. I looked at the bread. It was probably the kindest thing anyone had done for me since I arrived in this time. And it came from a local servant, not from my supposed Nordic compatriots. I tucked the bread into the pocket of my sweatshirt. A treasure. My loop of comedic suffering, as I came to call it, was just beginning. After almost 2 hours, when I finally finished the last latrine, my body ached in places I didn't know existed. My hands were raw. I felt victorious. I dragged myself out of the latrine area, dreaming of finding a dark corner to collapse in. That's when Bjorn found me. He had a smile on his face, which was always a bad sign. Chivina, Valper. Good work, pup. He slapped my back, which almost made me cough up a lung. Nu, Arsem ERTSVO Gray Umbingast, Orion Indi, A with acute or Anaver Kefni. Now, since you're so good at handling filth, there's another task. He took me to the stables. Horses. Lots of horses. And what do horses produce in abundance? Exactly. My job was to remove the manure from the stables. Apparently, The platoon's sanitation specialist had a diverse work portfolio. The irony was overwhelming. Outside, in the courtyard, the warrior elite of the world practiced their deadly art. And I, the time traveler, the observer of history, was being demoted down the social food chain. I started as a potential recruit, was demoted to bathroom janitor, and was now promoted to manure scooper. At any moment, I expected them to hand me a needle and thread and tell me to mend everyone's socks. As I filled a wheelbarrow with dirty hay, I deepened my reflections on Viking hygiene. It was a fascinating paradox. These men were obsessed with personal cleanliness. Their beards were works of art. Their nails were clean. They smelled of soap and oils. But their surroundings were functional. The stables were dirty because they are stables. The latrines were a constant challenge. They seemed to draw a clear line between the personal body and the outside world. The body was a temple to be cared for, a reflection of status and self-discipline. The rest was just the rest. Dirt to be managed, not eliminated. This was also reflected in their worldview. They were pragmatic. They weren't in Constantinople for idealism. They didn't fight for the Byzantine Empire out of love for Greek culture or the Orthodox Christian faith. They were here for one reason: it was the best job in the world. The most dangerous, yes, but the most profitable. They were mercenaries, the oldest form of entrepreneurship. They sold a skill, violence, to the highest bidder. And the emperor paid. He paid in gold, in silk, in status. He kept them close, a loyal pack of wolves in his golden palace, to keep the other snakes at bay. And it worked. For more than 300 years, the Varangian Guard was the pillar of imperial security. Emperors came and went, were blinded, exiled, murdered by their own families, but the Guard remained, loyal not to the man, but to the institution of the throne and the gold it guaranteed. As I pushed the heavy wheelbarrow out of the stable, towards a compost pile the size of a small car, I saw something that made me stop. A group of Varangians was gathered in a circle. They weren't training. They were quiet. In the center of the circle, one of them was sitting on a stool, while another, with a surprisingly steady hand, was running a needle and a thread of dark ink into his skin. A tattoo. They weren't the generic tribal patterns you see in movies. They were intricate lines, interlocking knots, writhing mythical beasts. Art. A form of personal expression, of identity, in a world where they wore a uniform. Many of the men had their arms and chests covered in these dark blue marks. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met Vikings in the 10th century, described them as being covered from the tips of their fingers to their necks with these images of trees and figures. Once again, the reality was more complex and artistic than the stereotype. Bjorn approached me, pulling me out of my anthropological trance. He looked at my work. He made a sound of approval that sounded like a small landslide. Ler Hrat. You learn fast. He then pointed to my sweatshirt. Engatureki gengium svona. Liter ut eins og betlari. Ea vera, eins og griki. But you can't walk around like this. You look like a beggar. Or worse, a Greek. He threw me a bundle of rough fabric. It was a simple tunic, of brown wool, the kind a servant or a low-ranking recruit would wear, and a pair of loose trousers, tied at the waist with a leather cord. Kleduigayata. O gilozoid va with acute, sco. Put this on. And get rid of those shoes. He pointed at my sneakers with a look of profound disgust, as if they were two sick creatures. I didn't argue. I went to an empty corner of the stable, the most private place I could find, and changed clothes. The wool was rough and itchy. The pants were too wide. And taking off my sneakers to walk barefoot on the dirty stable floor was a spiritual defeat. But when I was done, I looked less like a time traveler and more like a local nobody. A complete nobody. Which, under the circumstances, was a big improvement. It was camouflage. When I came back, Bjorn handed me a piece of dark bread and a hunk of cheese. It was the first real food I had received from them. I ate with a hunger I didn't know I had. The bread was hard, the cheese was salty, and it was the best meal of my life. I thought maybe my workday was over. That maybe now I could find a bale of clean hay and sleep for a week. I was wrong. Of course. Nagaya Fleddy. Enough lazing around, said Bjorn, already turning away. Vapnen Urfa Averapsu. The weapons need to be polished. Of course, they do. He led me to a room full of weapon racks. Swords, spears, and above all, axes. Dozens and dozens of axes. My new task was to sit on a stool with a cloth and a pot of oil and polish each blade until I could see my tired, freckled face in it. I picked up the first axe. The blade was wider than my hand. The edge was so thin it looked like it could cut the air. It was a perfectly balanced and terrifyingly functional piece of metal. As I ran the oiled cloth over the cold steel surface, I could feel the history there. The small nicks, the almost invisible scratches. Each one told a story. A desperate parry, a well-aimed blow. One of the older guards, the one who had been arguing about the fence earlier, entered the room. He watched me for a moment. His name was Gjedel. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from wood by a talented but impatient artist. He took the axe I was polishing. He held it with a familiarity that only comes from years of use. Etta Gvina. This is good work, he said, referring to my polishing. A crumb of approval. I almost cried with gratitude. He then looked at the blade, thoughtfully. Haima, asamtima, verum va underbua ackerfire ng. Aralaga murfer. Ekibara pusa oxyfire grikja. At home, at this time of year, we would be preparing for the thing. Discussing laws about inheritance. Not just polishing an axe for a Greek. There it was again. The nostalgia for order, for law, for the assembly. It was a tension that seemed to exist in all of them. The longing for a world where they were more than just muscle for hire, where their voices mattered in the making of the rules. Here, they obeyed another man's rules. Rules they didn't make. In exchange for a wealth they could never have dreamed of at home. It was the expatriate's dilemma, the mercenary's melancholy. And I was there, in the middle of it all, polishing the symbol of their profession and their exile, understanding, for the first time, that the lives of these men were not just about raids and battles. It was also about what they had left behind. I kept polishing, one axe at a time, as the daylight outside began to fade. Each axe felt heavier than the last. My Viking Age adventure was, so far, a long and exhausting journey of unskilled labor. And something told me the next day wouldn't be much different. There is a level of exhaustion that transcends physical fatigue. It's a depletion of the soul. My arms ached from polishing enough axes to equip a small army. My back protested from the wheelbarrow full of manure. My nostrils were still in a state of shock. I finally found a relatively clean corner in the armory, curled up like an armadillo, and fell into a dreamless sleep, lulled by the smell of oil and cold steel. The night in Constantinople was not silent. There were the distant shouts of the night watchmen, the barking of dogs, the sound of bells marking the vigils. But for me, it was the deepest silence I had ever experienced. A silence from modern worries. No hum from the refrigerator, no cell phone notifications, no traffic noise. Just the heavy breathing of sleeping warriors and the weight of history all around me. My brief period of peace was interrupted, as always, by a leather boot prodding my ribs. It was Bjorn. Obviously. He had become my personal alarm clock, my project manager of suffering. Vakna, Valper. Wake up, pup. He tossed me a helmet. It wasn't one of those horned helmets from cartoons, a complete myth, by the way. Imagine fighting in a shield wall with horns on your head. It would be a logistical disaster. It was a simple, conical metal helmet with a nasal guard. Heavy and uncomfortable. Kimmermiaker. You're coming with us. Apparently, my status had been elevated from resident janitor to combat extra. They still wouldn't give me a real weapon, which was a relief for me and probably everyone around me, but they needed an extra body. A body to look big and intimidating. Since I am the antithesis of big and intimidating, I assumed the staff shortage was severe. They gave me a round wooden shield, as heavy as a manhole cover, and a short spear. I was told to hold the spear and do nothing else. A role I was born to play. We left the barracks in a formation of 10 men. The morning sun was still low, painting the sky orange and purple over the domes and rooftops of the city. And for the first time, I saw Constantinople for real. Walking the streets as part of a Varangian Guard patrol was a completely different experience. The crowd, once an anonymous hum, now parted before us like the waters of the Red Sea. People looked at us with a mixture of fear, resentment, and awe. We were the Emperor's barbarians, his alien protectors. Untouchable. The city was a marvel. A labyrinth of wonders. We passed the Forum of Constantine, a gigantic circular square with a monumental porphyry column in the center, brought from Rome. On top, a statue of Constantine himself, the city's founder. The streets were paved, mostly clean, with covered porticos to protect pedestrians from the sun and rain. There were shops selling everything, the finest silks from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, furs from Russia. It was the center of the world, the terminus of all trade routes, and the wealth was palpable, almost vulgar in its display. Bjorn, marching beside me, seemed completely indifferent to it all. His gaze was focused, scanning the crowd, the windows, the rooftops. He wasn't there to admire the architecture. Eki stara, Valper. Don't stare, pup. He muttered without moving his head. Lita handum. Hinderfella vapn. Look for hands. Hands hide weapons. I tried to imitate his intensity, looking at people's hands. But my nerd brain was overloaded. I saw a shining mosaic on a church facade and my mind started to wander about Byzantine iconography. I saw Greek inscription and tried to translate it. I was the worst bodyguard in history. Our destination was a government building near the Hippodrome. A courthouse. Our task, to stand guard outside while a Byzantine nobleman, a high-ranking bureaucrat named Alexios, presided over a trial. Apparently, Alexios had enemies, and the emperor wanted to make sure he kept breathing. We were positioned on either side of the courthouse's grand entrance. And there we stood. Still. In silence. Under the hot sun. The minutes dragged on like hours. The boredom was physical torture. My feet began to ache. The helmet felt like it weighed a ton. The spear, which had seemed light at first, now felt like it was made of lead. I tried to shift my position, and Kjetil, the older, more serious Varangian, gave me a look that could freeze lava. I stood still. To pass the time, I started observing the life in the square in front of the courthouse. And it was there that I saw a microcosm of Byzantine justice, which made me think again about my Varangian colleagues and their longing for the thing. A dispute broke out between two merchants in a nearby stall. One accused the other of selling adulterated olive oil. The argument grew heated. Within minutes, a city official, an Ephor, appeared. He didn't break up the fight. He didn't listen to both sides. He simply extended his hand. The accused merchant, the richer of the two, discreetly placed a few coins in the official's outstretched palm. The official then turned to the accuser and berated him for disturbing the public peace, threatening him with a fine. The poorer merchant protested, was ignored, and eventually walked away, defeated. Justice was swift, efficient, and completely corrupt. It was all settled in less than 5 minutes with a small bribe. My brain immediately made the connection. I remembered Kjetil and his friend arguing about the fence. They wanted to solve the problem at the thing. And what would that be like? I could imagine it. The assembly gathering in an open field, under the sky. There would be no bewigged judges or robed prosecutors. The accuser would present his case before the assembled free men. The accused would present his defense. Witnesses would be called. Evidence would be presented. The law, memorized and recited by the Lexcumor, would be the guide. And the final decision would be made by the assembly, by the community. It might be a lengthy, noisy process, full of fiery speeches, but it was, in its essence, transparent. It was the people's justice. Of course, it wasn't an egalitarian paradise. There were powerful men who could influence the assembly with their wealth and status. Blood feuds could distort judgments. But the fundamental principle was different. Justice was not a commercial transaction conducted in an alley, but a community act carried out in plain sight of everyone. Here in Constantinople, justice was a labyrinth. There were laws upon laws, codes dating back to Justinian, lawyers who specialized in obscure loopholes. It was a system designed to be impenetrable to the common man. A system where power and money spoke louder than truth. And the Varangians, men from a culture with such a different approach to law, were there to protect this very system. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with one of the axes I had polished. Hours passed. The sun was high in the sky. Sweat trickled down from under my helmet. I was in a state of torpor, almost meditating on my own discomfort. That's when the courthouse doors opened. The nobleman Alexios came out. He was a middle-aged man with a soft, arrogant face, dressed in blue and gold silks that probably cost more than Bjorn's entire family farm. He was flanked by his own assistants and secretaries, who fanned him and held scrolls for him. He passed by us without giving us a single glance. We were part of the furniture. Expensive and deadly furniture, but furniture nonetheless. Our task was to escort him back to his oikos, his mansion in one of the city's wealthy neighborhoods. We began to march, forming a protective box around the nobleman and his entourage. The crowd, as always, parted. That's when it happened. On a narrower street, someone in a second-floor window of a building threw a ceramic pot. It wasn't large, but it was thrown hard, in Alexios's direction. Before my brain could even process what was happening, Kjetil moved. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply took a step forward into the side, raising his large round shield above his and Alexios's heads. The pot shattered against the shield's iron-reinforced wood. Shards of ceramic rained down on us. In the same instant, Bjorn and two other Varangians already had their axes in hand, their eyes fixed on the window from which the pot came. They didn't storm the building. Their only mission was to protect Alexios. Two other guards closed the formation around the nobleman, pushing him forward. "Afram! Forward!" Bjorn growled. The march quickened. Alexios looked pale but tried to maintain his composure. His assistants were panicking. We, the Varangians, were calm. This was what they were paid for. It was just another day at work. I, on the other hand, felt my heart pounding in my throat. The sound of the pot shattering on Kjetil's shield was so sudden, so violent. The reality of that world, the fact that death could come from a second-story window at any moment, hit me full force. This wasn't a history book. It wasn't a movie. It was real. And I was in the middle of it, holding a useless spear, dressed like a sack of potatoes. We arrived at Alexios's mansion. It was a stunning place, with an inner courtyard with fountains and mosaics on the floor. Private guards, employed by the nobleman himself, opened the gates for us. Alexios finally turned to us. He didn't speak to Kjetil, the man who had literally just saved him from a concussion or worse. He spoke to the leader of our small detachment, a Varangian named Rolf. He said something in Greek, and one of his assistants handed Rolf a small leather pouch. Rolf took the pouch. It was heavy. The sound was unmistakable. Gold. A bonus. A thank you in the only language he thought we understood. Rolf didn't open the pouch. He just nodded and dismissed us with a gesture. Our task was done. On the way back to the barracks, the mood among the Varangians was light, almost cheerful. They didn't talk about the danger, about the attack. They talked about the bag of gold and how it would be divided. Kanski get eg keept an armring sem eg sa markinum, said one of the younger ones. Maybe I can buy that bracelet I saw at the market. Jettel, the silent hero of the day, just walked, looking straight ahead. I moved closer to him. Does that happen often? I asked in English, forgetting he wouldn't understand me. Then I corrected myself, pointing back towards the mansion and making a gesture of something falling. Jettel looked at me. He understood what I was asking. He shrugged, a minimal movement. Stunned him. Sometimes. He then looked at the shield on his arm. There was a deep gash in the wood where the pot had hit. He ran a finger over the mark. Svegna Borger Kieseren Vel. That's why the emperor pays well. And that was the essence of it all. The contract. The danger was part of the job. Death was an occupational hazard. The gold was the compensation. Simple. Pragmatic. Emotionless. I looked at my own hands, still sore from manual labor. I looked at the spear I was carrying. I hadn't risked anything. I hadn't done anything. I was just a spectator with a front row seat. A ghost in a helmet. We returned to the barracks as night fell. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I had seen the wealth of the empire, the corruption of its justice, and the lethal calm of its protectors. And I had learned the most important lesson of the day. In Constantinople, a shield is more powerful than the law. And gold is more powerful than both. After my exciting excursion as a ceramic target and glorified spear holder, I expected to be rewarded with, perhaps, a day off. Or, more realistically, a task that involved neither excrement nor the possibility of sudden death. Instead, the universe, in its infinite comic wisdom, decided I needed a new career. Bjorn found me the next morning, not with a helmet, but with 2 empty wooden buckets. A momentary relief, until he pointed to the other end of the barracks complex, an area I hadn't explored, from which smoke was rising in a smell that wasn't of leather or steel, but of baking bread and stew. The kitchens. Kvenmanerner Van. The women need water, he said, with the same impassive expression as always. Og riendua missa ekifoturner I brunnen, Valper. Our eru durarien. And try not to drop the buckets in the well, pup. They're more expensive than you. My new job, water carrier. I had officially exhausted all the entry-level manual labor jobs of the 11th century. At any moment, I expected them to teach me how to spin wool. Carrying the buckets from the well in the center of the courtyard to the kitchens was a repetitive and tiring job. But it gave me an excuse to enter a part of Varangian life that most historians can only speculate about, the domain of women. We tend to imagine these mercenary enclaves as exclusively male worlds, but the reality was much more complex. Many Varangians came to Constantinople to spend years, sometimes decades, in the emperor's service. They didn't live in a vacuum. They formed communities. Some brought their wives and children from Scandinavia. Others, perhaps most, married local women or other Scandinavian women who came to the city seeking opportunities. The kitchens and the adjacent family quarters were a world apart. The testosterone and latent violence of the training yard gave way to an atmosphere of focused and efficient domestic work. The air was hot and humid, thick with the smell of wood smoke, cooking root vegetables, salted fish, and something sweet and spicy that I couldn't identify. The women who ran this place were as formidable as the men outside, just in a different way. There were Norse women, tall and blonde, with their hair tied in practical buns, their sleeves rolled up to reveal arms strong from kneading bread and carrying water, a job I was discovering was quite difficult. And there were local, Byzantine women, with darker skin and black hair, who moved with a graceful familiarity through the environment, teaching their Nordic counterparts the secrets of Mediterranean spices and ingredients. No one paid much attention to me, the weird red-headed kid carrying water. I was just another pair of hands, part of the invisible infrastructure that kept the war machine running. And this invisibility gave me a chance to observe. I saw a Norse woman, named Gudrun, I overheard, teaching her young son, a little boy of about 5 with his father's blonde hair and his Greek mother's dark eyes, how to shape small loaves of bread. She spoke to him in Norse, and he replied in a mixture of Norse and Greek. He was a child of two worlds, a small product of the Varangian to Greek route. What would happen to him? Would he grow up to be a guard like his father, swinging an axe in defense of an emperor? Or would he become a merchant in Constantinople, using his knowledge of two cultures to thrive? I was looking at the face of medieval globalization. My focus on Viking hygiene gained a new dimension here. If the men were clean, the women were the driving force behind that cleanliness. I saw huge cauldrons of water boiling over the fire, not for cooking, but for washing clothes. They beat the wool and linen tunics on washboards with vigorous energy, using a type of primitive soap made from animal fat and ashes. The clean clothes were wrung out and hung up to dry in the sun, filling the air with a clean, laundry-like smell. This contrasted with my own clothes. My brown tunic and wool pants, which I had been wearing for a few days, were starting to develop a personality of their own. I smelled of sweat, smoke, and a faint hint of horse manure, like a niche perfume for the historically unfortunate. In a corner, an older woman was sitting on a stool, not cooking, but working on a small vertical loom. Her hands, gnarled with age, moved with a hypnotic speed and precision, weaving colored threads into a complex pattern. Textile production was a vital skill and an art form. Clothes were not bought ready-made, they were produced, mended, and cared for with a diligence that we, in the age of fast fashion, simply cannot comprehend. She wasn't just making a piece of cloth, she was weaving her family's wealth and status. A well-woven and colorful strip of fabric could be worth a small fortune. I was on my 10th trip from the well, my shoulders burning, when a scene caught my attention. Two women, one Norse and one Byzantine, were having a discussion. It wasn't a fight, but a tense negotiation. The Norse woman, Helga, was holding a broken bone comb. The Byzantine woman, Zoe, was gesturing to a basket of vegetables. They were trying to reach an agreement. From what I could gather from the mix of languages and gestures, Helga was accusing Zoe's son of breaking her son's comb. There were no shouts. No threats. It was a domestic problem, a neighborhood dispute. And it made me think, once again, of the thing. Obviously, they wouldn't call a national assembly for a broken comb. But the spirit of it was there. They were trying to solve the problem between themselves, through negotiation. The compensation wouldn't be in gold or silver, but in goods. Zoe was offering some turnips and onions as an apology. Helga didn't think it was enough. Finally, the older woman at the loom, the matriarch of that small universe, intervened. She said a few calm words in Norse to Helga. Then, a few words in broken Greek to Zoe. She acted as the lgskumor, the law speaker. She proposed a solution: Zoe would give the vegetables, and Helga would accept the apology, and her husband, who was good at carving wood, would fix the comb or make a new one. The two women thought for a moment, then agreed with a nod. The dispute was settled. Peace was restored in the kitchen. It was justice on a micro scale. Community. Compensation. Mediation. So different from the bribery I saw in the square or the sudden violence in the streets. It was a reminder that history is not just made by emperors and generals. It's made by women settling disputes over broken combs, by children learning to make bread, by men and women building a life together in a strange land. My water-carrying task finally ended when the huge water barrels in the kitchen were full. I was hoping I could hide in a corner, but the matriarch at the loom, whose name was Inga, called me over with a gesture. She pointed to a pile of plucked fowl, chickens, I think, and to a knife. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. She wanted me to clean and cut them. I had never cut up a chicken in my life. The closest I'd come was picking up a rotisserie chicken from the supermarket. I looked at the dead bird, then at the knife, then at my 21st century sweatshirt hidden under my medieval tunic. The distance between my normal life and that moment seemed like an uncrossable ocean. Inga must have seen the panic in my eyes, because she let out a sigh, a mixture of pity and impatience. She took the knife from my trembling hand and, with swift, precise movements, demonstrated how to do it. She was as efficient as Bjorn with his axe. In less than a minute, the chicken was perfectly cut into pieces. She handed the knife back to me and pointed to the pile. The message was clear: your turn. I spent the next hour on the most visceral and disgusting task of my life. It was a mess. I cut everything wrong. But eventually, with occasional guidance and disapproving looks from Inga, I managed. In the end, I was covered in, well, you can imagine. When I was done, Inga handed me a small loaf of bread and a piece of dried fish. Apparently, this was the standard form of payment for horrible jobs. I accepted it gratefully. She then pointed to the back door of the kitchen, which led to a storage and garbage disposal area. She wanted me to take the scraps and entrails outside. Of course, she did. I took the bucket of scraps. The smell was indescribable. I went out the back door into the service alley behind the kitchens. It was a dark, damp place, full of old barrels and broken crates. I dumped the bucket's contents onto the designated pile and turned to leave, dreaming of a bath I probably wouldn't have for a week. It was then that something caught my eye. Leaning against a pile of firewood, almost completely hidden by a piece of old canvas, was an object that didn't belong there. It wasn't a barrel, it wasn't a box, it wasn't trash. It was a book. Not a rolled-up scroll or a Byzantine codex with ornate wooden covers. It was a familiar-looking book. Dark leather cover, worn with time. No visible title on the front. My heart began to beat faster. It couldn't be. It was impossible. How did it end up here? With my hands still dirty, I approached and pulled back the canvas. There it was. Unmistakable. The metal clasp, the pattern on the cover. Temps Deviationum. It was there, in the middle of 11th century garbage, in an alley behind the Varangian Guard's kitchen in Constantinople. Waiting for me. As it always did. I didn't know if I felt relief, joy, or a deep dread. Probably all three at once. My ticket back home. My curse. I looked around. The alley was deserted. I picked up the book. It was heavy, real. The pages smelled of dust and home. I knew what I had to do. Holding the Temps Deviationum again was strange. The worn leather under my dirty fingers felt like the only truly familiar thing in weeks. It was my problem, my curse, but it was also my only way out. It was the eject button for my terrible historical work experience. My first instinct was to open the book right there, in the middle of the trash and chicken guts, and get the hell out of that century. But I couldn't. This book's magic is loud, flashy, and unpredictable. Doing it in the heart of the Varangian Guard complex would be the equivalent of setting off a firecracker in a library. A library full of men who solved disturbances with axes. I needed a safe place. A place where I could have 5 minutes of peace without being recruited to clean something or being used as a human shield. With the book hidden under my itchy wool tunic, I left the alley and returned to the main courtyard. Night was truly falling now, and torches had been lit, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air was colder. The workday was ending. And I did something I didn't expect. I stopped. Leaning against a pillar, pretending to be just a tired servant, I watched the scene one last time. It was like watching the end credits of a very, very strange movie I had been miscast in. In the training yard, a few men were still practicing, their movements slower now, almost like a violent meditation under the flickering torchlight. I saw Bjorn showing a recruit how to properly wrap the leather on an axe handle for a better grip. He was a patient teacher, despite his brutal appearance. A good manager, in a way. From the direction of the kitchens, I could smell stew and hear the muffled sound of laughter. I saw Inga, the matriarch, come out to throw a bucket of water. She looked around, her stern face softened by the firelight, the queen of her small domestic kingdom. A kingdom that ran with the same efficiency and pragmatism as the army she helped sustain. I saw Kjetil, the silent veteran, sitting on a bench, sharpening a small knife, his gaze lost in the distance. What was he thinking about? The fence in his homeland? The gold he had won that day? The family he might have left behind in Norway? These giants, these terrors of the battlefield, were also men filled with a quiet melancholy, exiles by their own choice, trading a life of community for one of wealth and danger. I thought about the paradoxes I had witnessed. The warriors obsessed with personal hygiene who lived in an environment of functional filth. The men from one of the most legalistic and democratically inclined cultures of the time, serving as the strong arm of an absolute despot. The husbands and fathers who, during the day, were the most efficient killing machines in the world. Nothing was black and white. History, up close, is not made of stereotypes. It's messy, contradictory, and deeply human. And stinky. We can't forget that part. With one last look, I turned and headed for the only place where I could have some privacy, the armory. The place where I had slept, my first and only room in this era. It was dark and silent inside. The smell of oil and steel was almost comforting now. I found my corner, behind a pile of old shields. I sat on the cold floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was now or never. I placed the book on my lap. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the cover. The pages seemed to find their own way, flipping quickly until they stopped on a spell I had never seen before. It wasn't to go somewhere. The Latin words looked different. Revert cursum, ad punctum origines, domum. Reverse the course. To the point of origin. Home. I took a deep breath, a final puff of 11th century air. And I began to read aloud. The words came out as a hoarse whisper. Tempus, radi. The air around me began to vibrate. A low hum, like a million bees, filled the room. Philum nec retro. A faint light began to emanate from the pages, a pale blue light that made the shadows of the axes on the walls look like skeletal claws. Ad locum ubi omnia coeperant. The humming grew louder. The light grew brighter. I felt that familiar, horrible sensation of being pulled in every direction at once. The smell of steel and oil was replaced by that inexplicable smell of ozone and a laughing goat. The armory dissolved in a swirl of blue light. I saw images flashing before my eyes, Inga's stern face, Bjorn's cynical smile, the glint of gold, the blade of an axe, the mosaic of a saint. A chaotic summary of my trip. And then, wham! Silence. Real silence. And the smell. Mold. Dust. Old wood. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the concrete floor of my grandmother's basement. The only light came from my prehistoric flashlight, fallen beside me, still emitting a pathetic, yellowish glow. The book was closed, inert, beside me. I was home. I got up slowly. My whole body ached. My hands were scratched and calloused. I was wearing a rough, stinky wool tunic and baggy peasant pants. My feet were bare and filthy. And I was sure I smelled like the compost pile from the Varangian Guard stables. I looked around. The dusty shelves, the cobwebs, the creaky wooden staircase that led to the real world. Everything so normal. So absurdly, wonderfully normal. I picked up the book and the flashlight. I went up the stairs, each step a protest from my tired muscles. I opened the basement door and entered the house. The smell of my grandmother's apple pie was in the air. I almost cried. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and threw the book in a corner. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A pale, red-headed kid with braces, wearing the clothes of a medieval servant, with messy hair and dirt on his face. It was me. The grumpy nerd. The accidental historian. The worst Varangian in history. I survived. I took off those clothes as if they were on fire and threw them in the trash. I got in the shower and stayed there for maybe an hour, until the hot water ran out. I used almost a whole bottle of shampoo. And even after, I could still smell the phantom scent of smoke and sweat. Dressed in my most comfortable sweatshirt and pajama pants, I lay down on my bed. My soft mattress, my pillow. Luxuries I would never see the same way again. My Viking Age adventure was over. I didn't learn to fight with an axe. I didn't win a fortune in gold. The only thing I got was a backache and a new appreciation for basic sanitation and labor rights. But I saw it. I saw living history. And it was much stranger, more complicated, and more interesting than any book could describe. And as I finally began to fall asleep, safe in my own room, in my own time, feeling the weight of my body sink into the mattress, one last thought crossed my mind. I wonder where that stupid book will take me next time. And, for the first time, the idea didn't fill me with total dread. Just about 99% dread. Which, for me, is progress. But that's a worry for tomorrow. Or for the next century. Now, I just need to sleep. And with that, we conclude the broadcast of my most recent near heart attack. I hope you had fun at my expense. If the answer is yes, then I guess it's my contractual obligation to ask you to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell or whatever. That way, the algorithm can notify me that you're ready for my next public humiliation. Good night, and may your dreams be much more normal than my life.